Australian Liberal Senator James Paterson. It's great to have all of them here. Let's go to our first question tonight. It comes from Pravind Iswar.
Hi. So this morning, the US and China surprised the world by announcing a joint declaration on combating climate change. This joint declaration came about through several secret meetings over the past few months. So therefore, my question is, does this joint declaration signify a fundamental change in the relationship between these two superpowers, who up to now have been fundamentally opposed in the areas of security, trade and technology?
James Paterson, does this not, at least from China's side, say China is being recognised here by the US as a country of perhaps even equal standing, that it needs to do a deal with, to deal with something that both sides have recognised as an existential crisis?
Well, Stan, when it comes to emissions, China is much more than an equal to the United States because it is the world's largest emitter and by some margin. And of course, the United States is the second largest emitter. China has been increasing their emissions every year up until this year and will do so for a number of years yet. And if we are to have any hope in reducing global carbon emissions, it will require China to do so. So the Australian government certainly welcomes this initiative, but we're closely scrutinising how it's implemented in practice because at the end of the day, the planet pays on results, not on promises, and we have to very closely scrutinise that.
Our next question comes from Meg Truella.
Thank you, Grant. Yesterday, Paul Keating addressed the National Press Club and questioned why Australia is, and I quote, running back to Cornwall to find security in Asia. How could Australia support China's growing power due to our geographic proximity without in turn supporting its increasingly authoritarian ideologies?
James Paterson, the question though goes to this idea of why we keep running to the Atlantic or why we keep looking to powers such as the UK when our geography, and Paul Keating had made this point, our geography is Asia and the preponderant power of this region is China. Why do we keep looking to, Chris is talking about the 20th century, to 20th century powers in a 21st century world?
Well, Stan, I think it makes sense that in a 21st century world with instantaneous communication that we would seek to form close partnerships with countries wherever they are in the world that share our values. And obviously the United Kingdom and the United States don't just have shared values but shared history. But to say that that's all that we're doing to secure our security is totally wrong. And it's like Paul Keating is unaware of the development of the Quad or the fact that it's been upgraded to the leaders level under this Prime Minister's leadership. And in fact, instead he denigrated our two most important security partners in the region, India and Japan. His great vision for Australia in Asia was that we would seek security in Asia rather than from Asia. Well, we are seeking security in Asia with partners like India and Japan, and all he can do is be negative about that and denigrate it, and I think it reflects very poorly on him.
Ed Husick, Paul Keating didn't spare the Labor Party either, or Penny Wong, in saying that there is nothing that separates the Labor Party's position on this from the government's position. Do you think he's right?
Well, what I liked out of the speech yesterday, here we are saying the great thing about our country is a vibrant democracy can be able to have, challenging ideas and that we can test where we go and we can have this difference of opinion. And then after he gave his speech, it felt like so many people had jumped on their chairs. I mean, it is not bad.
The point he made about Labor was that you are not having that context.
Let me finish my point. So the point that I did want to make is that I don't have a problem if he... I think what's valuable about what he did is he injected some other points of view into this. You don't have to agree with everything he said, but as someone who has invested of himself and in terms of the Labor legacy from Whitlam, Hawke and Keating to engage with China, one, and two, to ensure that in terms of Asia as well, that we make, and what I thought was important with what he said, was that we can make a bigger future as well for ourselves, sitting on the cusp of 600 million people in ASEAN, and it seems like the major engagement that the coalition has in this space when it comes to Asia is to sign a trade agreement, and that's it. There doesn't seem to be...
Sorry, James. Okay, just quickly. Yeah.
Just quickly. This week, Australia signed the first ever comprehensive strategic partnership with ASEAN. No other country in the world has that. We did it this week. So, Ed, I just don't think you're up to date with what's happening.
Took 8 years. They've only
We're
had
the first in the world. We're the first country
interest.
in the world. Others have tried and they've failed, and we've succeeded, and we should be very proud of that. And you shouldn't talk down that achievement of our country.
Let's be clear about this. I'm talking you guys down. I'm not talking the country down. I'm talking down a coalition's neglect of the Pacific, where it cut foreign aid once it came in to power, and has not really fully restored it, and only rushed back in because it's the foreign imperative to do so.
To the contrary, we've refocused our aid program to the Pacific from the rest of the world, where it was under your leadership, under Labor. We prioritised Civic.
You've made your point, James. Let Ed finish, and I want to come back and question Ed about the original point. Well, on that question of weaponising, on that question of tension and potential conflict, our next question is Patrick Rollier.
At the National Press Club, Paul Keating said Taiwan was not a vital interest of Australia and denounced AUKUS. Is protecting a fellow democracy in the Indo-Pacific strategically important to Australia? And, in the instance of conflict, should we follow the US and militarily come to Taiwan's aid?
James Paterson.
I thought that statement by Paul Keating was a morally vacuous thing to say. It would be a very cruel and disappointing thing if Australia and our allies abandoned 24 million people who have their own vibrant liberal democracy and who have to be, their own self-determination has to be at the heart of any resolution of cross-straits tensions. And I think we should be very careful as an island nation and a liberal democracy of 25 million people that if we think that Taiwan doesn't matter to the world, why should we think that Australia matters to the world? The truth is that avoiding a military confrontation over Taiwan is both the right thing to do and in Australia's national interest. And we're able to contribute in a meaningful way to the deterrence of military solutions to that problem.
But Paul Keating's right, isn't he, when he says that Australia doesn't even recognise Taiwan. It recognises a one China. It doesn't recognise Taiwan. There's no alliance. As he says, there's no piece of paper setting out an agreement to defend Taiwan.
Well, we recognise that China has a one China policy, and we maintain strong unofficial links with the Taiwanese, and they are our 9th largest trading partner. And they are people who share quite a lot of values with Australia, a very strong value connection with Australia. And so I think it's very important that the United States, Australia, our allies, Japan and others do contribute to that credible deterrence for a military solution to that problem.
James Paterson, just quickly to the point that Chris Uhlmann raised, what could Australia do? To go back to the submarines, what good would be submarines that we were getting by 2040, when by 2030, according to the Pentagon, China will have at least as many as 1,000 nuclear warheads? How on earth can we deal with that? And what good is a submarine deal against China's increased might?
Well, Stan, of course, any one country on their own, and particularly a relatively small country like Australia, certainly couldn't deter a major power like China from doing what it wants. But in concert with our friends and allies, cumulatively, we can offer a very credible deterrence if we acquire the capability that we need and if we are clear about our intent. And the $270 billion that we're spending on new military capability over the next decade, plus the nuclear submarines, which we will obtain by 2040, will be a credible contribution that we can make to that collective task. I don't suggest for a second on our own.
But not a credible deterrence to China.
Well, I don't suggest for a second on our own, but cumulatively with our allies and friends in the region, it does make a difference. And if we are all stand shoulder to shoulder on these issues, we stand a very good chance of averting this, of preventing this from happening and all the catastrophic consequences that would follow.
And our next question comes from Steve Coe. Steve?
Oh, sorry.
There you are.
I lived in Asia for about 18 years, from Singapore to Hong Kong and even in Shanghai. When I repatriated back down under, I was so appalled at the marginalizing of the Chinese here. Essentially, it's questioning our national pride constantly. Now, most politicians say all the right same things, but their action often belies their voices. My question actually is directed at the two politicians on the panel. How will the two major political parties recover from the the erosion in trust by the 1.2 million Chinese Aussies?
So, Steve, can I just ask you, you talk about the impact it's had on you and you've experienced this. What's been your experience?
Here in Australia.
Do you feel as if there's been a palpable shift in this in recent times?
It's very subtle, but it's very relentless. And I like to see some leadership from the politicians there. The example in that direction would be, for example, on the Liberal side, the Senator Eric Alberts, he questioned a Chinese Aussie.
Well, James Paterson, how is that acceptable?
Stan, I think that was an unfortunate episode because I don't think it was Eric Abetz' intention to suggest that Yun or any other China's Australian is anything other than a fully welcome participant in Australia's democracy and fully entitled
how did
to
you
whatever
feel,
views.
Did you feel as if your allegiance was being questioned?
Definitely,
Okay.
definitely.
James, well, Yun felt that way.
Yeah, and I regret that. That is regrettable, and it is counterproductive because it's vitally important that the 1.2 million people of Chinese heritage in Australia feel fully part of Australia, part of our community, and of course they are. There's 200 years of migration from China to Australia and a great history of Chinese contribution to Australia. My own participation in these debates came out as part of a concern about the oppression that the Chinese diaspora in Australia faces from the Chinese Communist Party, and it is wrong and counterproductive for them to feel in any way excluded from Australian society.
So, given that TikTok is a tool that's been deployed by China and is having an immense amount of negative effects on young Australians in particular, do you think that the government should look at interventionary measures with this app? It's evidently causing a huge amount of negative side effects for Australians, both young and old, and it's funneling a tremendous amount of our data back to Beijing. Senator Josh Hawley in the US stood up against TikTok and actively voiced his views on the fact that this app could be a security threat. So will and when will the Australian government step in and intervene?
James Paterson.
I would urge all Australians to be careful with all social media platforms and the data that you give them, but also to be particularly careful with those that are headquartered in China, even those that are owned by ostensibly private companies like ByteDance, as TikTok is, because in reality there is no such thing as a strictly private company in China. Jack Ma used to think he was running a private company in Alibaba, and he learnt the hard way that he wasn't. All large Chinese enterprises essentially serve the objectives of the Chinese Communist Party, or they wouldn't be allowed to exist. And so we should be very mindful of that. In terms of Australian government response to that, I think we've demonstrated on a bipartisan basis over about a decade that, if necessary, we are willing to step in and ban high-risk vendors, for example, in the rollout of the NBN and 5G, like Huawei and ZTE. And if it's necessary to do the same with TikTok, then I don't think we'll hesitate to do it.
And I don't know, are you going to answer my question, James? We're almost out of time. What do we do with former Prime Ministers? Are they of any use?
Number one, Stan, Paul Keating is literally the last Australian I would send to China to represent our interests. Number two, to take one from each side of politics, there are former Prime Ministers who make a very positive contribution. Look at the way that Julia Gillard and John Howard have conducted themselves since they lost office. They have behaved in an exemplary way and they set the example for everyone else.
Well, you've almost taken us right up to the minute. Thank you so much for that. That's all we have time for. Thanks again to our panel, Yun Zhang, Chris Dillman, Ed Husick, Lavina Lee and James Paterson.